He had a childhood dream of becoming a physician. Growing up in a single-parent home with dire poverty, poor grades, a horrible temper, and low self-esteem made that dream seem like an impossibility until his mother, who only had a grade 3 education, challenged her son to strive for excellence. Today, he holds one of the most prestigious positions in the field of medicine anywhere in the world as the director of the Division of Pediatric Neurosurgery and professor of neurosurgery, oncology, plastic surgery, and pediatrics at the Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions. Join me now as we meet this remarkable man and hear his inspirational story.
It has stood the test of time. God's book, the Bible, still relevant in today's complex world. It is written, founded by George Vandeman, sharing messages of hope around the world. Today, Bill Santos presents Gifted Hands.
Dr. Ben Carson holds more than 40 honorary doctorate degrees. He is a member of the American Academy of Achievement, the Horatio Alger Society of Distinguished Americans, and many other prestigious organizations. He sits on the board of directors of numerous organizations, including the Kellogg Company, Costco Wholesale Corporation, the American Academy of Achievement, and is an emeritus fellow of the Yale Corporation, the governing body of Yale University. Most recently, he was appointed by President George W. Bush to serve on the President's Council on Bioethics. He is the president and co-founder of Carson Scholars Fund, which recognizes young people of all backgrounds for exceptional academic and humanitarian accomplishments. He is also the co-founder of Angels of the OR, which provides grants to assist families with non-covered medical care expenses of both adult and pediatric neurosurgery patients with complex medical conditions. He has authored 3 books, Gifted Hands, Think Big, and The Big Picture. Dr. Carson has been married for 30 years to Candy, his wife, and is the father of 3 boys. His mother, Sonia Carson, who made this all possible, is alive and well. Dr. Carson joins me today. Dr. Carson, welcome, and thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Dr. Carson, let's go back to the beginning. Where did you grow up?
Well, I actually was born in Detroit, and I had a reasonable beginning. My parents were together at that time. My father was working in a factory. And then, unfortunately, my mother discovered that he had another family.
Wow.
And that, as you might imagine, occasioned a little bit of discomfort in the relationship.
Absolutely, yes.
And in fact, they were divorced, and we moved to Boston.
Oh, I see.
To live with her older sister and brother-in-law. And it was a very typical tenement type of situation, multi-family dwellings with boarded up windows and doors and broken glass and sirens and gangs. And our favorite people actually were the drug dealers because they would bring candy for the kids.
Oh.
So we loved seeing them. Unfortunately, in retrospect, I realized that all of the drug dealers got killed young. None of them ever seemed to live for very long.
My goodness.
And both of my cousins that we lived with were killed. I mean, it was a very violent environment, and I assumed that I would probably die certainly by the age of 25. It was just an assumption. Rats and roaches. But while we were enjoying that environment, my mother would be out working 2, sometimes 3 jobs at a time as a domestic, cleaning other people's houses, because she really was adverse to being on welfare.
I see.
And she felt that, once she began to accept the welfare lifestyle, that her motivation would change and that it would be a trap and that she would never be able to improve. So she figured if she worked long and hard enough, somehow we would eventually be able to return to Detroit, and she could be independent. And after a couple of years, that is in fact what happened, and we were able to return. But still in a multifamily dwelling, still with significant wildlife. But she at least was independent at that time.
Yes.
And I was just the most horrendous student that you can imagine.
Now, your mother only had a third grade education, but yet she seemed to really push both you and your brother to excel in school and to learn.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, she worked as a domestic in the homes of very well-to-do people.
I see.
And she was not just working, she was observing. And she would come home and she would say, people who achieve a lot in life, they don't sort of sit around just, looking at TV all day. Or they don't sit on the corner, with a brown paper bag, drinking, thinking that nobody knows what's in the bag. They actually spend time planning and strategizing. And she started saying, we have choices to make in life.
Interesting.
And we can be like the guy sitting on the corner with the bag, or we can be like the guy who lives in this fabulous house and does great things. But, you have to make the choice. And she would actually take us sometimes to the homes that she worked in.
Oh, I see.
Just so that, it wasn't just her saying it. We could actually see that there was a difference. And I think that did have an impact.
It did.
It did.
I see. Now, you had a nickname at school.
I did. My nickname was Dummy.
Now, why was that?
Because I didn't believe that I could learn. And my classmates pretty much agreed with that. And the teachers agreed, everybody kind of agreed. And, I was the kid in the back of the room, shooting paper wads and telling jokes. And, my favorite thing was getting other people in trouble.
Oh, I see.
Because, they would get kicked out of class, and then I wouldn't be the only one who didn't learn anything that day. That's really what negative peer pressure is all about. A lot of kids don't realize that. And I was actually the negative peer.
Isn't that something? Now, that was at about 10 years of age.
Correct.
Now, by 12 years of age, just in 2 years, you went from being the dummy to one of the brightest kids in your class.
Right.
What happened?
Well, I went to the hospital and had a brain transplant. Well, actually, it wasn't quite that simple. My mother was really very distressed about how poorly I was doing in class. I was failing just about everything. My brother was also doing poorly. And she just didn't know what to do, despite all the things she would tell us about, succeeding in life. It just didn't seem to be getting through. So she prayed and she asked God to give her the wisdom to know what to do to get her young sons to understand the importance of intellectual development. And God gave her the wisdom. At least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was all that wise, but it was to turn off the TV and let us watch only 2 to 3 pre-selected TV programs during the week.
Well, that's interesting.
And with all that spare time, she mandated that we read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries and submit to her written book reports.
So 2 books every week?
Every week.
And a book report?
And book reports
Wow.
on each of them.
Interesting.
But we didn't know that she couldn't read them.
Oh,
She would underline things and highlight things and put little check marks there. And then she would say, now let's discuss this. And then, as we talked about it, then she would chime in. So, we thought, that she was reading
now,
these
isn't
things,
that something?
But interestingly enough, even though we were desperately poor, never had money for anything, I soon discovered that between the covers of those books, I could go any place.
Interesting.
I could be anybody. I could do anything. All of a sudden, I began to imagine myself in a laboratory, performing chemical experiments, completing electrical circuits, having a telescope, discovering new galaxies, microcosms under the microscope. And I began to know things that nobody else knew.
Oh, is that fascinating?
And previously, if the teacher would ask a question, I would never raise my hand. But now I got to the point where I was starting to know things. And I remember the first time I raised my hand, everybody was so shocked. And they all turned around and they were ready to laugh hysterically because they knew this was going to be good. But I had the right answer.
Isn't that incredible?
And you know, I began to believe in myself. The other kids began to believe in me. You know, within a matter of a year and a half, the same kids who were calling me dummy were saying, Benny, 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 how do you work this problem?
Isn't that something?
And I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, you know, the real key here is establishing within a child a sense of confidence.
Interesting.
And if you can establish that, you've won more than half the battle. And once you establish a love for learning, and now you got all these books available to you. I mean, I got to the point where you never saw me without a book. My nickname changed from dummy to bookworm.
Isn't that interesting?
Because if I was waiting for the bus, I had a book. I was on the bus, I was reading a book. In the bathroom, I had a book. At the kitchen table, my mother would say, Benjamin, put the book down and eat your food. It just didn't matter. But in that process, think about the kinds of things that are occurring. I'm looking at words all the time.
Yes.
So I learned how to spell. I wasn't the first one to sit down the spelling bee anymore. In fact, I won some of the spelling bees.
Isn't that interesting?
You know, I had to take those words and put them together into sentences. So I learned grammar and syntax. So all of a sudden, you know, my composition scores went up. And I had to take those sentences and make them into concepts, which means using your imagination. So you start to become a much more creative person. So all of these things have great, great benefits. And,
yes.
you know, a lot of people say, I can learn anything I need to learn by watching DVDs and videos. Well, that's like saying you can develop your muscles by watching someone else lift weights. You know, it doesn't work that way. And you have to actually use that incredible brain that God gave you if you really want to get the most out of it.
That's fascinating. Now, you have a basic philosophy that it's not where you begin that's important, but it's where you're going that's the real issue. Could you sort of just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, you know, we live in a society today where we have so many of our social scientists trying to explain people's behavior. You know, they really didn't have a choice because, you know, when they grew up, this was going on or that was going
right.
on. And, you know, their father was an alcoholic and, you know, so of course they turned out that way. And I have real issues with that.
Okay.
If we didn't have a brain, then I would accept that
right.
completely, no problem. Or if we had a very simplistic brain, I would accept that. But the fact of the matter is, we have these huge frontal lobes. Unlike any of the other creatures that God made, we have these gigantic frontal lobes. And what do we do with those? We process information.
Interesting.
We're the only animals with the ability to extract information from the past and the present and to project it into the future, which means we can plan, we can strategize, we can learn from mistakes, we can learn from other people's mistakes. We don't have to simply blindly follow those things. We can analyze. And that's why I say it really doesn't matter so much where you came from as long as you have a brain and you're willing to exercise it and use it. But the minute you decide that you want to wallow in excuses, then the ball game's over. Because if you've got an excuse, you don't need to do anything.
Yes. Interesting. You then went on to Yale University,
That's correct.
Is that correct? And then went to study medicine at the University of Michigan.
Correct.
And then at age 32, you became the director of the Division of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital.
Actually, it was at age 33.
At age 33.
But yes, it all worked out incredibly well once I became very focused. Now, you know, it's interesting how all that evolved because when I finished my residency, I went to Australia.
Oh, I see.
You know, we had had the grand opening of the new neuroscience building at Johns Hopkins while I was chief resident. So since Hopkins is sort of the modern birthplace for neuroscience, everybody who was anybody, particularly in neurosurgery, was there, including one of the senior neurosurgeons from Australia who took a liking to me and said, "You should come to Australia and be our senior registrar at a major teaching hospital in Western Australia." And I said, "Australia, are you kidding?" You know, I didn't say that to his face, but that's what I was thinking. I mean, where the heck is Australia? You know, you drill a hole through from Baltimore, you come out in Australia. I wasn't going over there. And, you know, I'd heard all these things about Australia. They had a whites-only policy and all this stuff, so I kind of poo-pooed the idea. And it seemed like every time I turned around, there was someone saying, "Good eye, mate, how you going?" I kept running into Australians everywhere. And every time we turned the TV on, there was a special about Australia. And I said to my wife, "I think the Lord wants us to go to Australia." So, you know, we sold all of our earthly belongings and packed our bags, and off we went. And our friends were saying, "You'll be back in 3 weeks." But little did they know we didn't have any more money, so we couldn't come back. We were going to be there.
How long were you in Australia?
We were there for a year.
Wow.
And it turned out to be just the most fabulous experience you could imagine. You know, Australians are very friendly. They love Americans. And, you know, there were only 4 neurosurgical consultants in Western Australia. And once they discovered that I knew how to operate, you know, they largely left me in charge of the major teaching hospital, and so they could go out to the private hospitals. And I was doing, you know, 3 craniotomies every day, and I got an enormous amount of experience. So when I returned to the States and joined the faculty at Hopkins, shortly after that, the director of pediatric neurosurgery left, and instead of them going out and getting somebody with a lot of gray hair and a lot of experience, they said, "Look, Carson's had all this experience and he can do all this stuff. Let's make him the chief."
Wow.
And it was just fabulous. And it worked out very well. Although a lot of times people would come to Johns Hopkins to see Dr. Ben Carson, chief of pediatric neurosurgery, and I would walk in and they would say, "When's Dr. Carson coming?" But once I began to explain to them what the disease process was and what we planned to do, you know, their doubts quickly vanished.
I heard you speak one time, and you talked about how you pray before you operate and you put everything in God's hands. Maybe you could share with us some of the interesting experiences you've had in performing surgeries and seeing God's work.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, you know, God created the body, so obviously He knows the most about it. So I always ask Him to direct me by giving me wisdom.
Yes.
To know what to do. And I, whenever I see a patient who's going to have surgery, I ask them to make sure that they ask God to be present also. And you'll find that there are very few people who are undergoing brain surgery who don't think that's good advice. Yes. But, you know, probably one of the more fascinating cases was the case of the Banda twins, who were conjoined at the top of the head facing in opposite direction. And this was done in South Africa, and I was asked to come over and head up the team. And it was very complex. There had been 13 attempts to separate twins joined in that way before, none of which had been successful. And I knew it was going to be a huge endeavor. I just said, "Lord, you know, you got to help me, because more talented and smarter people than me have tried and have failed." And I was able to get the MRIs and the CT scans and the angiograms and to integrate them into our 3D virtual workstation, put on my 3D goggles and study all the blood vessels before I actually went over to Africa. And I discovered that the common drainage system was a little narrower in the middle than it was on either end. The common neurosurgical literature said you should decide which twin to give the drainage system to, and then divide them over the course of several operations, divided in time by many weeks or months, and that they would develop collateral circulation. Well, I felt impressed that we should concentrate on the area that was narrowing down.
Okay.
And when I explained that to the team, they said, "You're the boss, we'll do whatever you want to do." But I remember going to that operating room 3 days before New Year's of '98. There was a big sign over the OR that said, "God bless Joseph and Luca Banda," and they were having prayer service, and I was thrilled. Wonderful. And I said, "Bring in a stereo so we can play inspirational music." Well, 19 hours into the operation.
19 hours.
19 hours. We were only 3/4 of the way finished.
Wow.
The part that remained was so complex. The blood vessels were engorged. They were entangled. It appeared impossible. We stopped. We went to conference. I suggested maybe we could cover the area over with skin and come back in several months, and they will have developed enough collateral that we could cut through. And the doctors from South Africa and Zambia, which is where the twins were from, said, it's a great idea, and I know it would work at Johns Hopkins, but we don't have the ability to keep partially separated twins alive. They'll die. Now I went back in there. I really felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I didn't have all my fancy equipment that I have at Hopkins. I said, Lord, it's up to you. And I went in there and started cutting between those blood vessels that were so thin, you could actually see the anesthetic bubbles coursing through, just daring you to make a nick in them. And make a long story short, when I made the final cut, over the stereo system came the Hallelujah chorus. Everybody had goosebumps. And when we finished that...
I'm getting goosebumps right now listening to you tell it.
When we finished that operation, after 28 hours, one of the twins popped his eyes open, reached up for the endotracheal tube. The other one did the same thing by the time we got to the ICU. Within 2 days, they were extubated. Within 3 days, they were eating. Within 2 weeks, they were crawling. And now they just finished the 3rd grade, and they're doing fine. But, you know, the real success there was the reaction of the people who had been following the story so closely. They were literally dancing in the street. Their level of self-esteem was so high. And you see, that's what I really think success is all about, using the talent that God has given you to elevate other people.
Interesting. Well, it's incredible, that experience and what you do. We have parents watching. We have some young people watching. I hope my children are watching today, listening to you. Any practical advice you'd give to parents that are watching?
Absolutely. Key thing is don't allow your child to become a victim. Don't ever accept excuses. And be a positive person. Reinforce their good qualities. Maybe they are a terrible student. Maybe they are, you know, someone who has a horrible temper. And you can talk to them about those things, but emphasize their positive things and begin to give them a sense that there's something extraordinary about them. And when they begin to internalize that, they're going to move a lot further, a lot faster. So, and then, you know, you have to also make sure that you don't just say it.
I see.
You have to model it.
Right.
So if you're saying to your kids, don't sit there and watch TV all day long, and then you prop yourself up in front of TV, that doesn't go very far.
Yes. Well, I got through about half of the questions that I'd like to. I was wondering if you'd be kind enough to join us again, and maybe I could get through some of the other questions.
It would be my pleasure to do so.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Carson.
My pleasure.
In his book, Be an Extraordinary Person in an Ordinary World, Dr. Robert Schuller tells the story behind a seed he received one day from a man by the name of Ansley Mueller. He was a farmer in Pleasant Plains, Ohio. For years, said Dr. Schuller, I'd been teaching the principle that any fool can count the seeds in an apple, but only God can count the apples in one seed. Well, Ansley Mueller had been listening to this principle, and he sent Dr. Schuller this letter with a soybean seed. The letter read, it was 1977, Dr. Schuller, and I lost half my crop. It was a bad, bad year. It was so wet I couldn't get half of it harvested, and it didn't develop. So at the end of the year in October, I would walk through the fields and try to pick up a bushel here and a piece there, and then I saw standing by itself a most extraordinary, unusual-looking soybean plant. I walked over and I was shocked by its size and its good looks. I went and carefully picked off the pods. There were 202 pods, and I opened them and counted out 503 soybeans. I took them home, I kept them in a pan all winter, and they dried out. The next spring, they just seemed special to me. And in 1978, I took those 503 soybeans and I planted them in a little plot behind my house. And when October came, I harvested 32 pounds. 32 pounds. I dried them out, and in the winter, and in 1979, I took those 32 pounds and planted them on an acre. When October came, I harvested 2,409 pounds. I planted them on 68 acres, which was all the land I had available. And in October, just a year ago, the letter said, I harvested 2,100 bushels and cashed it out for $15,000. Now, Dr. Schuller, one plant, 4 years later, $15,000. Not too bad, is it? So, Dr. Schuller, here's your bean. Friend, may I ask you today, what are you doing with your bean? God has granted you the potential to do anything. In fact, the Bible promise is clear in Philippians 4:13. It says, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. I read that when Jesus looked at someone, He never saw them for what they were, but rather for what they could become if they would let Him take charge of their life. Won't you pray with us right now that Jesus may come into your life and make you into the man or woman He wants you to be? Please join Dr. Carson and I now as we pray. Father in heaven, we want to thank You for Your leading in the life of Dr. Carson. Oh, what an inspiration he is to all who hear him. Father, we pray that You may come into the lives of those viewers right now that are inviting You, and You may work the miracle of a renewal in their lives, that they may do all things through Jesus Christ, is our prayer in His name. Amen. Dr. Carson, thank you again for joining us. It was a thrill to have you here.
My pleasure being here.
Those of you that enjoyed the program today, I want to let you know that Dr. Carson has agreed to join us again next week. And so we look forward to seeing you then. Until then, remember, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.